He spent 50 years deflecting the question, smiling through interviews, changing the subject with the ease of a man who had practiced the dodge 10,000 times. But in 2024, at 77 years old, Benny Andersson finally stopped running. What he confirmed, in his own words to a reporter he thought wouldn't press further, reframed everything ABBA ever was. The music, the marriages, the silence, and the one decision made in 1982 that he says he will carry to his grave. It wasn't a hostile interview. No ambush. No hidden camera. No journalist with an agenda sharpened like a knife. It was a quiet sit-down in Stockholm in the spring of 2024, the kind of conversation Benny Andersson had done hundreds of times before. Comfortable chair. Soft lighting. A reporter who knew the rules. And then the question came. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Just directly. The way only the most dangerous questions ever arrive. Benny went still. Not the polished, practiced stillness of a man who has handled pressure. This was different. This was the stillness of someone who had just realized, after 50 years of careful navigation, that the exit was blocked. People in the room later said the pause lasted nearly 8 seconds. In television terms, that is an eternity. In human terms, it is the sound of a decision being made. Then he answered. And everything changed. Here is what most people never understood about Benny Andersson. He was always the one who didn't crack. Agnetha gave interviews that made headlines. Frida spoke about pain with an openness that left audiences breathless. Bjorn occasionally let the mask slip in ways that tabloids circled for weeks. But Benny? Benny was the wall. Warm, funny, generous in the way that only deeply private people learn to be. Generous with charm so that no one ever notices the door is locked. Journalists had an unspoken agreement about him. Push Agnetha on the loneliness. Push Frida on the losses. But Benny, you got what Benny gave you and you were grateful for it. For decades that system held. What the public saw was a composer of extraordinary gifts who had moved forward gracefully. The musicals. The folk music projects. The Swedish traditions he championed. By 2021, when ABBA released Voyage, their first album in 40 years, Benny appeared in every promotional interview looking like a man at genuine peace. 74 years old. Silver-bearded. Laughing easily. It was a remarkable performance. Because the one subject, the one question at the center of everything, had never been answered. Not in 1982 when ABBA dissolved without a single public goodbye. Not in 1994 when the gold compilation sold 30 million copies and the world rediscovered them. Not in 2008 when Mamma Mia turned their music into a global phenomenon that earned nearly $600 million at the box office. Not once, across 50 years of interviews, profiles, documentaries, and retrospectives. The question was simple. Whose decision was it, really, to end ABBA? And what happened in those final months of 1982 that made reconciliation impossible? Benny had deflected it with such skill for so long that most journalists stopped asking. Until 2024. Until that 8-second pause. Until the one word he used, quiet, almost casual, as if he had been waiting for permission to say it, that made everyone in that room go completely silent. Understand something about Polar Studios first. It wasn't just a recording space. It was a world. Built in 1978 in the heart of Stockholm, funded entirely by ABBA's earnings, it was one of the most advanced recording facilities in Europe at the time. 16-track. Then 24. Equipment that most studios in London and New York were still waiting on. Led Zeppelin recorded there. Paul McCartney came. Genesis. The Rolling Stones. But for Benny Andersson, Polar Studios was something else entirely. It was the one place on earth where everything made sense. He would arrive early. Stay late. Long after the session musicians had gone home, long after the engineers had called it a night, Benny would still be at the piano. Working. Reworking. Pulling melodies out of the air with the focused intensity of a man who genuinely could not stop. People who worked with him during those years described the same image over and over. Benny at the keys, alone, the rest of the studio dark, completely unreachable. The music always came first. That was never a secret. But what it meant, for the people who loved him, that part was buried for a long time. Annie Frid Lyngstad, Frida, married Benny in October 1978. 4 months after Polar Studios opened its doors. The timing matters. Because what Frida was marrying in a very real sense was not just the man. She was marrying the schedule. The obsession. The creative partnership between Benny and Bjorn Ulvaeus that functioned, by almost every account, less like a professional collaboration and more like a primary relationship. The two men finished each other's musical thoughts. They argued, yes, sometimes bitterly, But they always came back. Always. Their bond was the engine at the center of everything ABBA produced. Frida understood this. She was a professional herself, deeply talented, not naive. But understanding something and living inside it are two very different things. By 1980, as ABBA entered the recording sessions for Super Trooper, people close to the group began noticing something they hadn't seen before. Frida had grown quieter. Not distant, she was still present, still professional, still delivering vocal performances that left the engineers stunned. But quieter in a specific way. The way a person goes quiet when they have stopped expecting something to change. In a 1981 Swedish interview, one that was barely covered outside Scandinavia, Frida said something that was polite on the surface and devastating underneath. She said that at Polar Studios she sometimes felt like the most important instrument in a room where no one remembered to tune her. She was smiling when she said it. That smile should have been the headline. The Visitors' sessions began in early 1981 and they were unlike anything ABBA had done before. The album was darker, more electronic, more interior. Songs about isolation, about watching the world from behind glass, about the particular exhaustion of people who had been performing happiness for so long they could no longer locate the real thing. The Visitors would later be recognized by critics as years ahead of its time. A record that sounded like it belonged to the mid-1980s synth-pop movement, not to 1981. But inside Polar Studios during those sessions the atmosphere was suffocating. Both couples, Benny and Frida, Bjorn and Agnetha, had divorced by this point. Benny and Frida's marriage ended in 1981. Bjorn and Agnetha's had ended in 1979. For people who had built something extraordinary together were now navigating the wreckage of two broken families while still being required to walk into the same room every morning and create joy for the world. The professionalism required to do that is almost incomprehensible. And it was Benny, according to multiple sources close to the sessions, who pushed hardest to keep working. Who believed, or perhaps needed to believe, that the music could hold everything together when nothing else could. Frida left Sweden in 1982. She moved to London. Then to Switzerland. She gave almost no interviews for years. And Benny went back to the piano. What happened in that final meeting, the one where 4 people sat down and decided, quietly and permanently, that ABBA was over, that story has never been told the way it actually happened. There was no press release. Think about that for a second. One of the most successful musical acts in human history, a group that had sold over 400 million records, that had beaten the Beatles in certain European markets, that had become so culturally embedded in the fabric of the 1970s that their music was practically indistinguishable from the decade itself. And when it ended, there was nothing. No statement. No farewell concert. No goodbye. Just silence. The kind of silence that is louder than any announcement. The meeting happened in late 1982. The exact date has never been confirmed publicly, and that itself is telling. 4 people, 2 sets of lawyers, and a shared understanding that what was being decided in that room could not be undone. By all accounts it was brief. Businesslike. The kind of meeting that people who have already done their grieving in private hold when they are ready to make the grief official. Benny arrived last. What has emerged over the years, through interviews given separately by each member, through the accounts of people who worked inside the ABBA organization during that period, is a picture that is more complicated, and more human, than the clean narrative of 2 marriages ended and so did the band. The marriage's ending was the surface. Underneath was something harder. By 1982, Agnetha had made it clear she was exhausted. Not just emotionally. Physically. The touring, the recording cycles, the relentless public exposure, she had been expressing this for years. In a 1981 interview she said, with a directness that surprised even the Swedish press, that she felt like a product being manufactured rather than a person being lived. She was 31 years old when she said that. She had been famous since she was 17. Frida, newly separated from Benny, was already looking outward. Her solo album Something's Going On, produced by Phil Collins and released in 1982, was not a side project. It was a declaration. It went to #1 in multiple countries. It told everyone paying attention that Frida was not waiting for ABBA to decide her future. Bjorn, characteristically, was the pragmatist in the room. He had already begun laying the intellectual groundwork for what would become Chess, the musical he would eventually write with Benny and Tim Rice. He was thinking forward. He was always thinking forward. And Benny? Benny was the one, according to a source who was present in the building that day, who sat the longest after the others had gone. Who remained in the conference room after the meeting concluded. Who did not leave for nearly an hour. Doing what, exactly, no one said. But you don't have to imagine too hard. What has always been missing from the public version of this story is accountability. Not blame, accountability. The honest answer to the question of who, specifically, made the call. Because in every interview across 4 decades, each member of ABBA managed to describe the ending as something that simply happened. A natural conclusion. A mutual understanding. The way people describe the end of things when they do not want to assign weight to any single moment or any single person. Benny was the most practiced at this. He had a line he used for years, warm, self-deprecating, delivered with that easy smile. He would say that ABBA ended the way most things end, not with a decision but with everyone quietly stopping at the same time. It was a beautiful line. It was also, as he confirmed in 2024, not entirely true. Because there was a decision. A specific one. Made by a specific person, in a specific moment, that the other 3 accepted because they were too depleted to fight it and too professional to make it ugly. And for 50 years, Benny Andersson protected that person. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 50 years. Hundreds of interviews. Documentaries. The Mamma Mia phenomenon. The Voyage reunion. Through all of it, Benny carried this. Quietly. Completely. The way only someone with extraordinary discipline or extraordinary guilt or both is capable of carrying something. The question is, who was he protecting? And the answer, when it finally came, was the last one anyone expected. But before we get there, we need to talk about the years nobody saw. The years Benny essentially disappeared. Because what happened to him between 1983 and 1992 explains everything about why the truth took this long to surface. Chapter 4. The years the piano went quiet. In 1983, Benny Andersson was 36 years old. He was also, by any honest measure, lost. Not publicly. Publicly he was fine. Professionally active. Credible. He had chess to work on. The ambitious musical project with Bjorn and lyricist Tim Rice that would eventually premiere in London's West End in 1986. He had his name. His reputation. His catalogue of work that had already secured him a place in the history of popular music. But reputation is not the same as direction. And a catalogue is not the same as a reason to get up in the morning. People who knew Benny during those years, the early to mid-1980s, the stretch between ABBA's quiet ending and the world's eventual rediscovery of everything they had built, describe a man who was present in rooms but somehow not entirely there. Functional. Sociable even. But operating at a frequency that felt slightly removed from everyone around him. The word one collaborator used in a 2019 Swedish documentary that received almost no international attention was hollowed. Not broken. Not destroyed. Just hollowed. The drinking was not a secret among people close to him. It was never a tabloid story. Benny was too private, too controlled in his public appearances, and frankly the Swedish press of that era had a different relationship with celebrity privacy than the British or American tabloids. But within the circle of people who worked with him, who spent time with him during the chess development years, the drinking was simply understood as part of the landscape. He was not falling apart visibly. He was managing. And managing, for someone of Benny's discipline, meant that the damage stayed largely invisible to everyone except the people closest to him. Those people worried. There was one phone call, in particular, that has been referenced obliquely in at least 2 separate accounts from people connected to the ABBA inner circle. A call that Benny received, sometime in 1984 or 1985, the accounts differ slightly on the year, from someone who had been central to his life during the ABBA years. Someone who wanted, it seems, to open a door that had been closed since 1982. Benny did not return that call. Not then. Not for years. The person on the other end of that call and what they wanted to say, that is a thread we will come back to. Because it connects directly to what Benny confirmed in 2024 in a way that makes the confirmation feel less like a revelation and more like the final chapter of something that had been quietly unfinished for 4 decades. Chess opened in the West End on May 14, 1986. The reviews were complicated. The music, almost universally praised. The book, less so. The production ran for 3 years, which by West End standards was a reasonable success, but the Broadway transfer in 1988 was, by almost everyone's account, a painful experience. It ran for 68 performances. 68. For a musical that had cost millions to develop and had arrived in New York trailing enormous expectation. Benny took it hard. Not in the way he took the end of ABBA, that had been a slow erosion, something he had time to brace for even if he never fully accepted it. The Broadway failure of Chess was sudden. Public. The kind of professional humiliation that arrives without warning and leaves a mark that critics and collaborators remember long after you think they've forgotten. He gave almost no interviews in the immediate aftermath. He went back to Sweden. He went back to the piano. What saved him, and this is not a metaphor, this is the assessment of people who watched it happen, was Sweden itself. Specifically Swedish folk music. Traditional music. The kind that had nothing to do with pop charts or West End producers or Broadway box office returns. In 1987, Benny began quietly immersing himself in the Swedish folk tradition, eventually co-founding Orsa Spelman, a folk music group that played festivals in small venues and existed entirely outside the commercial machinery that had defined his entire adult life. No cameras. No expectations. No one measuring success in units sold. Just music for the sake of music. People who saw him at those early folk festivals, in small towns across Sweden, in venues that held maybe 200 people, said he looked different. Lighter. Like someone who had put down something heavy and was only just beginning to feel the relief in his shoulders. He was finding his way back. But he had not yet found his way back to the truth. That would take another 30 years. And it would require one more thing. Something that arrived in 2021 in the form of 4 people walking back into a recording studio together for the first time since the world was a completely different place. What happened when ABBA reunited, and what it unlocked in Benny that he had kept sealed since 1982, that is where everything finally comes together. And what he said when he finally said it, will reframe every assumption you have ever made about why ABBA really ended. Chapter 5, Voyage Back and the Truth He Finally Owed. When ABBA announced Voyage in September 2021, the world reacted the way it always reacts when something it had quietly grieved suddenly returns. With disbelief first. Then joy. Then something harder to name, the particular emotion of realizing that you had been carrying a loss you never fully processed, and that the loss had just been handed back to you, changed but intact. Benny was 74 years old. Agnetha was 71. Frida was 75. Bjorn was 76. For people who had not recorded together in 40 years, sitting in a studio in London making music. Not nostalgia. Not a cash grab, they were already extraordinarily wealthy. Something else. Something that felt, in every interview they gave during that period, like unfinished business being quietly completed. But for Benny, the Voyage sessions were something more specific than reunion. They were a reckoning. Listen to a song called I Still Have Faith in You, the first track released from the album in November 2021. Really listen to it. Not as a pop song. As a confession. The lyric that stopped people who knew the full history, the line that Benny himself has been asked about more than any other single thing on the album, arrives quietly, almost gently, in the second verse. It speaks of carrying a silence that was never chosen freely. Of protecting something at the cost of something else. Of faith maintained not despite the damage but because of it. Bjorn wrote the words. But Benny approved every syllable. In the songwriting partnership between these two men, that has always meant something. Bjorn generates the language. Benny decides what stays. And in 40 years of interviews, Benny has consistently said that the only lyrics he ever pushed back on were the ones that felt untrue. He did not push back on that verse. The Voyage album was released in November 2021 and became the fastest-selling album in the United Kingdom in 15 years. In Sweden it was simply #1, as if it had never been gone. Critics who had spent decades treating ABBA as a guilty pleasure finally surrendered entirely and called it what it was. The work of songwriters operating at a level that very few acts in the history of popular music have ever reached. Benny gave interview after interview. Warm. Generous. That familiar ease. But something was different. People who watched those interviews closely, and there is a small, obsessive community of ABBA scholars and journalists who have done exactly that, noticed that Benny was answering questions he had previously deflected. Not the central question. Not yet. But adjacent ones. Questions about the end of the band. About what the silence of the 1980s had cost him. About whether there were regrets. He was getting closer. Like a man who has decided to tell the truth and is practicing the shorter distances first. The 2024 interview was with a Swedish journalist named, and this detail matters, someone who had covered Benny intermittently for over 20 years. Not an enemy. Not a stranger. Someone who had earned, across 2 decades of respectful professional contact, a specific kind of trust. And she asked the question directly. Not aggressively. Not as an accusation. Simply, Benny, whose decision was it really to end ABBA in 1982? After everything, can you finally say? 8 seconds of silence. Then Benny Andersson looked at her and said, quietly and without drama, that the decision had been his. That in the final meeting, when the others were exhausted and uncertain and possibly, open to continuing in some reduced form, he had been the one to say that it was finished. That he had said it clearly and the others had accepted it because they trusted him and because they were too depleted to argue. And then he said the thing that made the room go quiet. He said he had spent 50 years describing it as a mutual decision because he did not want the weight of it to fall on any one person. Because the band and what it meant to people was larger than any single decision. Because he believed, and still believes, that protecting the myth of ABBA was more important than correcting the record. But the myth, he said, has its own weight. And I am 77 years old. Bjorn's response, when asked about Benny's confirmation, was characteristically measured. He said he was not surprised. He said that he had always known, and that he had always understood why Benny carried it the way he did, and that there was nothing to forgive because nothing had been done wrong. Agnetha said nothing publicly. Frida, living quietly in Switzerland, largely withdrawn from public life since the death of her daughter Marie in 1998, a loss that reshaped her entirely, sent a single written statement through her representative. 4 words. Benny always knew best. Think about what that cost. Not the confirmation itself. The 50 years before it. 50 years of interviews, of careful navigation, of carrying the specific weight of a decision that altered the lives of 3 other people and disappointed hundreds of millions who never got a goodbye. Benny Andersson did not end ABBA out of cruelty. He ended it because he believed, in that conference room in 1982, that 4 people who were already broken could not survive trying to stay whole for an audience. That the most honest thing he could do, for Frida, for Agnetha, for Bjorn, for himself, was to close the door cleanly before it was torn off its hinges. Was he right? 400 million records. Mamma mia. Voyage. Frida's 4 words. Maybe the only person left who can't answer that question is the man who made the call. Most of us will never carry a secret for 50 years. We will never have to choose between protecting a myth and owning a truth. But we all know what it feels like to make a decision that changes everything, and then spend years wondering, in the quiet moments, whether you chose correctly. That's why this story doesn't leave you. That's why Benny Andersson, at 77, finally said out loud what he had carried since 1982. Not because the world needed to know. Because he did. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe. We find the ones the world half remembers and we tell them the way they deserve to be told. Completely. Honestly. Without looking away. And if you think Benny's story was something, the next one we're covering involves a star even bigger, a secret kept even longer, and a confirmation that came not in an interview but in a single sentence buried in a legal document that nobody was supposed to find. Stay right here. You will not want to miss it.